Responsibly.
Responsibly.
Can I rely on you to behave responsibly while I'm away?
Responsive.
Responsive.
A car with highly responsive steering. We try to be responsive to the needs of the customer.
Her condition is not responsive to drug therapy. I tried to get him talking, but he wasn't very responsive.
Respray.
Respray.
Rest.
Rest.
You look exhausted. Why don't you take a rest?
You carry these 2 bags and I'll bring the rest.
2 of the attackers were killed and the rest escaped.
Does anyone want the rest of this pizza?
He'll be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life.
Why don't you talk to him and put his mind at rest?
The aircraft skidded across the runway and finally came to rest in a cornfield.
My eyes came to rest on a photograph of a young man.
Give it a rest, Jack.
I gave the acting a rest for a while.
I was paying the rent and the bills and all the rest of it.
I'd say she's about 40. Yeah, and the rest.
The minister resigned and the government hoped that the scandal would finally be laid to rest.
She was laid to rest beside her husband. If you're tired, we'll stop and rest for a while. Rest your head on my shoulder.
Brassard rested his elbows on the table and leaned forward.
Their bikes were resting against the wall.
I need to sit down and rest my legs.
The man apologized, but Aunt Matilda refused to let the matter rest.
You may rest assured that it will be ready on time.
We will not rest until the murderer is found. We will not rest until the murderer is found.
My mother rests beside my father in the family graveyard.
I can rest easy knowing everything's under control. Success in management ultimately rests on good judgment.
The case against my client rests entirely on circumstantial evidence.
His eyes rested on a small figure in the distance.
The final decision rests with the president.
Rest area.
Rest area.
Restart.
Restart.
Attempts to restart the peace process.
Restate.
Restate.
He is not changing the rules. He is simply restating the policy that was established last year.
Restaurant.
Restaurant.
We went to a little Italian restaurant near Leicester Square.
He took her out for a 5-course dinner in a fancy restaurant. The company runs a chain of restaurants.
A new restaurant has just opened across the road.
Restaurant car.
Restaurant car.
Restaurateur.
Restaurateur.
Rested.
Rested.
We came back from holiday feeling rested and relaxed.
Restful.
Restful.
Restful music.
Rest home.
Rest home.
Restitution.
Restitution.
The restitution of the art treasures missing since World War II.
The offender must make restitution for the hurt that he or she has caused.
Restive.
Restive.
Communist leaders struggled to rule over increasingly restive populations.
Restless.
Restless.
The children had been indoors all day and were getting restless.
After a few weeks in Marseille, I grew restless and decided to move on.
Restock.
Restock.
The restoration.
Restoration.
A fund for the restoration of historic buildings.
Major restoration work will begin in May.
They're fighting for the restoration of democratic rights.
The restoration of the monarchy in Spain.
An attempt to secure the restoration of their lands.
Restorative.
Restorative.
The restorative power of sleep.
Restore.
Restore.
The government promises to restore the economy to full strength.
She was hoping that the Mediterranean climate would restore her to full health.
The National Guard was called in to restore order when riots broke out. Initiatives to restore peace in the Middle East. Vietnam restored diplomatic relations with South Korea on December 22nd.
Measures aimed at restoring public confidence in the education system.
A man whose kindness and sincerity really restored my faith in human nature.
Measures aimed at restoring public confidence in the education system.
A man whose kindness and sincerity really restored my faith in human nature.
The church was carefully restored after the war.
A Victorian fireplace restored to its former glory.
The treaty restored Okinawa to Japan.
A campaign to restore the death penalty.
Restored.
Restored.
After a cup of tea, she felt quite restored.
Restorer.
Restorer.
An art restorer.
He was described as a restorer of peace and order.
Restrain.
Restrain.
I had to restrain her from running out into the street.
He had to be restrained from using violence. Renwick restrained a feeling of annoyance.
She could barely restrain herself from hitting him.
Price rises should restrain consumer spending.
Restrained.
Restrained.
A restrained and cool-headed response to their criticisms.
The interior decoration is quite restrained.
Restraining order.
Restraining order.
Restraint.
Restraint.
The police were praised for their restraint in handling the demonstrators.
He urged the millions of protesters to exercise restraint.
Opposition politicians have called for restraints on public spending.
The government has imposed restraints on corporate mergers.
Sometimes police officers have to use physical restraint to control dangerous prisoners.
Restrict.
Restrict.
The new law restricts the sale of handguns. You may need to restrict access to certain files.
The agreement will restrict competition.
In future, we will restrict class sizes to 20 students.
The cramped living conditions severely restricted the children's freedom to play.
I'm restricting myself to 2 cigarettes a day.
Restricted.
Restricted.
It's difficult trying to work in such a restricted space.
Press freedom is severely restricted.
The sale of alcohol is restricted to people over the age of 18.
There is restricted access to this information.
The accident left her with restricted movement in her right leg.
In those days, women led very restricted lives.
No entry. Restricted area for army personnel only.
The damage is restricted to the left side of the brain.
Eligibility for 5 weeks' holiday is restricted to senior management.
Restriction.
Restriction.
Restrictions on immigration.
A 50-mile-per-hour speed restriction.
The law imposed new financial restrictions on private companies.
Tougher restrictions on alcohol advertising.
Restrictions on trade were lifted.
Restrictive.
Restrictive.
Many members thought the rules were too restrictive.
A restrictive policy on admission to the college.
Restrictive clause.
Restrictive clause.
Restrictive practices.
Restrictive practices.
Restroom.
Restroom.
Restructure.
Restructure.
Proposals to radically restructure Britain's electronics industry.
The major restructuring of our armed forces.
Rest stop.
Rest stop.
Result.
Result.
Accidents are the inevitable result of driving too fast.
High unemployment is a direct result of the recession.
The net result of all these changes is that schools should be able to deliver a better service to pupils.
Growing plants from seed can produce disappointing results.
With a little effort, you should achieve the desired result.
As a result of the pilot strike, all flights have had to be cancelled.
Sarah wasn't at school last week, with the result that she missed an important test. The results will be announced at midnight.
The football results.
A lot depends on the result of this match.
Results suggest that diet is very important. Police are awaiting the results of a forensic examination.
The experiments gave positive results in all cases.
When do we get our exam results?
She certainly knows how to get results.
For best results, always use fresh ingredients when you are cooking.
British Airways has announced disappointing results for the first half of the year. They were lucky to get a result on Saturday.
We're still dealing with problems resulting from errors made in the past.
How would you cope with unemployment and the resulting loss of income? An accident that resulted in the death of 2 passengers.
Resultant.
Resultant.
She is still trying to get over the attack and the resultant injuries.
Resume.
Resume.
She hopes to resume work after the baby is born. The rebels have resumed hostilities against government troops. He will resume training as soon as the injury is better.
Peace talks will resume tomorrow.
Will the delegates please resume their seats?
A brief resume of the day's events.
Resumption. Resumption.
Both countries are now hoping for a quick resumption of diplomatic relations.
Resurface.
Resurface.
One of the missing paintings suddenly resurfaced.
Nationalist tensions have resurfaced here.
Resurgence.
Resurgence.
There has been a resurgence of interest in religion over the last 10 years.
A resurgence in the popularity of 60s music.
Resurgent.
Resurgent.
Resurgent fascism.
Resurrect.
Resurrect.
The Home Office have resurrected plans to build a new prison just outside London.
Another failed attempt to resurrect his career.
The resurrection.
Resurrection.
A resurrection of old jealousies.
Resuscitate.
Resuscitate.
Doctors managed to resuscitate him. Mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Retail.
Retail.
A manager with 20 years' experience in the retail business.
We are looking for more retail outlets for our products.
A retail price of £8.99. The retail value would be around $500.
Retail sales fell by 1.3% in January.
The wine retails at £6.95 a bottle.
The decoder is expected to retail for under $300.
Their products are retailed all over Britain.
We only deal with wholesalers. We don't sell any of our goods retail.
Retailer.
Retailer.
Retailing.
Retailing.
There may be many job losses in retailing.
Retail park.
Retail park.
Retail price index.
Retail price index.
Retail therapy.
Retail therapy.
What you need is a bit of retail therapy.
Retain.
Retain.
You have the right to retain possession of the goods.
The state wants to retain control of food imports.
A lot of information can be retained in your computer.
Limestone is known to retain moisture.
I find it very difficult to retain facts.
He has retained a lawyer to challenge the court's decision.
We had to pay a retaining fee.
It's increasingly difficult to recruit and retain good staff.
Retainer.
Retainer.
Retaining wall.
Retaining wall.
Retake.
Retake.
An attempt to retake the city.
They had to do several retakes before the director was satisfied.
Retaliate.
Retaliate.
The British government retaliated by breaking off diplomatic relations.
The army began to retaliate against the civilian population.
Retaliation.
This action was undoubtedly in retaliation for last week's bomb attack.
The threat of massive retaliation against British troops.
Retaliatory.
Retaliatory.
A retaliatory attack.
Retard.
Retard.
Cold weather retards the growth of many plants.
Retarded.
Retarded.
Wretch.
Wretch.
The smell made her wretch.
Retell.
Retell.
Retention.
Retention.
The UN will vote on the retention of sanctions against Iraq.
Many people with heart problems suffer from fluid retention.
I have a real problem with retention of information.
Retentive.
Retentive.
Rethink.
Rethink.
An opportunity to rethink our policy on advertising.
It's time for a complete rethink of the way we farm our countryside.
Reticent.
Reticent.
She's strangely reticent about her son.
Reticulated.
Reticulated.
Retina.
Retina.
Retinal scanner. Retinal scanner.
Retinue.
Retinue.
He travelled with a huge retinue of servants.
Retire.
Retire.
Most people retire at 65.
He was forced to retire early because of poor health.
I retired from teaching 3 years ago.
Her decision to retire from her position as librarian of the Law Society.
Her drink problem has forced her to retire from public life.
He retired as a GP last year.
He became ill and was retired early.
I retired to my room to think.
He had to retire with a neck injury in the second half.
Retired.
Retired.
A retired teacher. Both my parents are retired now.
Retiree.
Retiree.
Retirement.
Retirement.
He became a keen golfer after his retirement from politics.
He announced his retirement as chief executive of the company.
She took early retirement last year.
Dad's approaching retirement age.
I hope you enjoy a long and happy retirement.
Will you be able to support yourself in retirement? A retirement pension.
Retirement. Retirement home.
Retirement home.
Retirement plan.
Retirement plan.
Retiring.
Retiring.
As a child, Elizabeth was very shy in retiring.
Retool.
Retool. The College Board has retooled the admission exams.
Retort.
Retort.
It's all your fault, he retorted.
He was about to make a sharp retort.
Retouch.
Retouch.
Postcards that have been retouched to cover the grey skies.
Retrace.
Retrace.
After a few minutes, he turned around and began to retrace his steps.
We shall be retracing the route taken by Marco Polo.
An investigation to retrace the dead man's last known movements.
Retract.
Retract.
He confessed to the murder, but later retracted his statement. The sea otter can retract the claws on its front feet.
Retractable.
Retractable.
A knife with a retractable blade.
Retraction.
Retraction.
The newspaper was forced to publish a retraction of its allegations.
Retrain.
Retrain.
One solution is to retrain the long-term unemployed.
She's hoping to retrain as a teacher.
Retread.
Retread.
Retreads of old TV shows.
Retreat.
Retreat.
The rebels retreated to the mountains.
They were attacked and forced to retreat.
He saw her and retreated, too shy to speak to her.
Perry lit the fuse and retreated to a safe distance.
It was not a conscious choice to retreat from public life.
The floodwaters are slowly retreating.
The Canadian government has retreated from a plan to kill 300 wolves.
After the noise of the city, he was glad to retreat to his hotel room.
Napoleon's retreat from Moscow.
The rebel forces are in full retreat.
The bugler sounded the retreat.
10,000 years ago, the ice began its retreat from Scotland.
I saw my aunt coming and beat a hasty retreat.
A retreat from hardline policies.
A country retreat.
I spent 3 weeks on retreat in Scotland.
Retrench.
Retrench.
A government policy of retrenchment.
Retrial.
Retrial.
The jury was dismissed and the judge ordered a retrial.
Retribution.
Retribution.
Victims are demanding retribution for the terrorist attacks.
Divine retribution.
Retrieval.
Retrieval.
A new system that should speed up information retrieval.
Retrieve.
Retrieve.
She bent down to retrieve her earring.
It took 4 days to retrieve all the bodies from the crash.
The new version of the software automatically retrieves digital information.
The General made one last desperate effort to retrieve the situation. The General made one last desperate effort to retrieve the situation. Retriever.
Retriever.
Retro.
Retro.
Retro 60s fashions.
Retro.
Retro.
Retroactive legislation.
A retrograde step.
Retroactive.
Retroactive.
A retroactive pay increase.
The legislation is retroactive to the 1st of June.
Retrofit.
Retrofit.
Plans to retrofit oil boilers.
Retroflex.
Retroflex.
Retrograde.
Retrograde.
The closure of the factories is seen as a retrograde step.
Retrogressive.
Retrogressive.
Retrogressive legislation.
Retrospect.
Retrospect.
In retrospect, I wonder if we should have done more.
Retrospection.
Retrospection.
Retrospective.
Retrospective.
A retrospective study of 110 patients.
Retrospective legislation.
Teachers settled for a 4.2% pay rise with retrospective effect from the 1st of April.
The new rule will be applied retrospectively.
A Hitchcock retrospective. A retrospective of painter Hans Hofmann.
Retrovirus.
Retrovirus.
Retry.
Retry.
Retsina.
Retsina.
Return.
Return.
It was 45 minutes before she returned.
Are you planning to return to Spain?
I have just returned from 5 months in Zimbabwe.
Alison decided to return home.
He left his country, never to return.
Carson returned the notebook to his pocket. I returned the books to the library unread.
Please complete the enclosed application form and return it in the envelope attached.
If the pain returns, take 2 of the tablets with some water.
David could feel his anger returning.
When peace finally returns to this country.
He smiled at her warmly, and she returned his smile.
I phoned him twice on Friday and left messages, but he never returned my call.
Thanks very much. I'll return the favour someday.
The police did not return fire.
Yes, he returned. I'm a lucky man.
Yeo was returned to Parliament with an increased majority. At the election, she was returned as MP for Brighton.
The group returned increased profits last year.
David waited for a moment to let his breathing return to normal.
The new chairman made the cuts necessary to return the company to profitability.
Nicholas looked up, grinned, then returned to his newspaper.
The children returned to school next week.
Ellie needed to return to work soon after the birth.
I will return to this problem in a moment.
We're all looking forward to your return.
I need to know the date of her return from Europe.
Malcolm decided to delay his return to York.
On his return from Canada, he joined the army.
A mother is appealing for the safe return of her baby son.
Police have arranged for the return of the stolen goods.
The United States called for a return to democracy.
A return to normal.
Rose's return to the teaching profession.
Jean is well enough now to consider her return to work.
The markets are showing extremely poor returns.
How can you get the best return on your investment?
The returns from farming are declining.
The average rates of return were 15%.
He is always helping people without expecting anything in return.
We offer an excellent all-round education to our students.
Liz agreed to look after the baby in return for a free room.
Key in the file name and press return.
Can I have a return to London, please?
She felt a return of her old anxiety.
David had noticed the return of worrying symptoms in the last few days.
An analysis of the 1851 census returns.
What are the returns from last night's voting?
A return ticket.
A return fare.
Returnable.
Returnable.
A returnable deposit of £50.
Return address.
Return address.
Returnee.
Returnee.
Returner.
Returner.
Returning officer.
Returning officer.
Return match.
Return match.
Return visit.
Return visit.
Retweet.
Retweet.
His tweets on the subject have been retweeted by thousands of people.
Reunify.
Reunify.
German reunification.
Reunion.
Reunion.
An annual reunion.
A family reunion.
A high school reunion.
Joseph's eventual reunion with his brother.
Reunite.
Reunite.
The children were finally reunited with their families.
The band will reunite for a U.S. tour.
Reuse.
Reuse.
The bottles are designed to be reused up to 20 times.
Reusable containers.
To purify water for reuse.
Rev.
Rev.
Reverend D. MacLeod.
They are revving up for one of the biggest fundraising events ever organized.
Investors keep putting money in US companies, revving up the economy even more.
Revalue.
Revalue.
The company's land has been revalued at £16.9 million.
The dollar has just been revalued.